because we all know what happened to Herbert Hoover, and secondly, anybody that's had that job knows that there's never been a powerful Secretary of Commerce. It started me on a lifelong collection of collecting oxymorons, contradictions in terms. My current favorite is the House Ethics Committee. I've got 49 others that might be far more interesting to you than me. He wants me to say something serious. It's a great pleasure to be here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. I'm a huge admirer of Lee Hamilton. He has done such a job of leading this center, and now with Jim Baker, he faces the very daunting task. I know you're focusing today on renewed competition from not just Europe and Japan, but in particular, rising economic powers of China and India. It seems to me around the world that other countries are learning the lessons that we taught them about the tremendous importance of capital investment and human investment in infrastructure and education and science and technology so as to build their comparative advantage. I believe that this country faces a series of long-term challenges, and I believe several of them that I'll mention are close to unsustainable, and which unfortunately have one other thing in common. I think we're largely ignoring all of them. Just to take one example at the beginning of what I consider a long-term and unsustainable challenge that threatens to consume staggering percentages of our GDP, not for investment, but basically for consumption, our entitlement programs. When 78 million boomers, twice the current generation of elderly, begin retiring in a few years. For those of you who don't study these things, you might be interested in how much spending is required, and I emphasize this is spending essentially on consumption and on the past, and old fogies like me, not on investment in the future. Over the next 35 years, the mid-case forecast is that spending will increase about 9% of the GDP. Maybe that doesn't sound like much to some people, but that's nearly 3 times what we've been spending on defense. The Concord Coalition, using what seem to be reasonable projections, estimate that entitlement spending plus interest will consume the entire federal budget in only 15 years. In other words, these numbers, it seems to me, documents the fact that if we fail to deal with entitlements, the other cherished federal programs that we have, that we talk glibly about, are likely to be decimated. It may help explain why we have conferences like this and we unanimously agree on the critical need to invest in research and development, and that's a competitive imperative, it seems to me. But reason perhaps we don't do much is someone might ask the rude question, where are you going to get the resources for that investment? You may not remember that in 1960, 5% of the federal budget was invested in basic research and development, which has been a very important source of major breakthroughs. Indeed, the internet, just to take one recent example, today that number has fallen to only 2% of the federal budget. So I think one could argue that the crowding out of vitally needed investments in basic R&D in this country has already been happening. Senators Alexander and Bingaman, as I understand it, have spelled out a number of specific steps in terms of funding R&D and improving our entire education system. I want to step back from those specifics to emphasize the critical importance of in my mind, of dealing with our overall series of deficits and debts that inevitably, in my view, will erode the political and economic power of this country, which we have led for 6 or 7 decades. But I do want to come back and urge us to focus on the root question. Where are we going to get the resources to make the critically needed investments that the senators speak of? These steps are going to be very difficult. They will take political courage, and I'd like to focus today a new generation of business leadership. And, horrible word that it is, will demand, in my view, some modest level of sacrifice on the part of all of us. Washington, the great political town, is much more aware than I am of the partisan and gridlock that has paralyzed this country's ability to deal with the future. I'm going to leave that to the Beltway pundits in Washington, because I am convinced that even the most enlightened political leadership will not succeed by itself. I want to focus on the need for far-sighted and courageous business leadership and the willingness of all Americans to step up to these challenges. In short, it is my fond hope that business leadership has not become the newest oxymoron. I've been very troubled by the criticisms of such serious journalists as David Wessel of the Wall Street Journal and Tom Friedman of the New York Times. Tom declared us businessmen as MIAs, or missing in action, on the major long-term issues that are confronting our economy. Weasel simply asked, where have the business statesmen gone? I asked myself, are these critics and people like myself being romantic? Has there ever been many business statesmen who took some real responsibility for the future? I'm old enough now to have my memories go back to the years just after World War II. At home, we were managing the transition from a wartime society, including the demobilization of 19 million soldiers. Abroad, we were trying to rebuild a shattered world economy, devoid of rules or institutions. The 1930s had been defined by a depression, by isolationism, and by beggar-the-neighbor trade wars. Yet the list of initiatives successfully undertaken and led by a hardy band of business leaders is breathtaking. The Employment Act of 1948, the Bretton Woods institutions, and the Marshall Plan. And when the Marshall Plan was announced, only 14% of Americans approved. They wanted to stay home. Then these business leaders led a massive public education effort, and America changed its mind. How do I explain, if I am correct, the lack of today's business leadership? When Henry Kissinger and I were in the White House, he once walked into the press briefing room with a simple question: does anyone have any questions for my answers? I thought that was pretty good myself. You had to be in that White House to understand that you had to have your sound bites, and it didn't make any difference what anybody asked. You had to get those sound bites out, so it was particularly relevant to the Nixon administration, at least. One might begin by asking the question, does business have sufficient clout today to make a real difference? I think the answer to that is yes. One need only look at so many of their impressive legislative achievements. So I look elsewhere and I ask you some of the following, and the business community some of the following questions. Has business become so hyper-competitive, so global, so demanding, so focused on corporate governance, that it feels it has little time left for anything else? Or have recent corporate scandals left CEOs feeling so morally crippled that they feel they lack public credibility? Or do the executives worry that the gotcha media will defame us if we stick our heads up? Or do they feel that Washington is so relentlessly vindictive and polarized at the present time that we fear retribution if we occupy a lonely but centrist and sensible position? Or has the anonymity of the non-citizen become the best executive policy? Or did the big party in the 1990s, when all of us were getting fat, rich, and happy, leave CEOs caring less about standards of behavior in the future? Or do our stock markets so discount the future that we assume we are judged largely by short-term results? Or are CEOs saying to themselves, if my tenure now is down to only 4 or 5 years, let somebody else worry about our collective future? A shortage of business leadership, I believe there is, but there is most certainly no shortage of daunting and unsustainable long-term challenges that are crying out, perhaps I should say screaming out, for business leadership, indeed for all kinds of leadership. We did have one humorist in the Nixon administration, which may strike all of you as an oxymoron, the idea of a Nixon humorist, that is. Herb Stein, once said, if something's unsustainable, it tends to stop. And he said, if you don't like this one, perhaps you should consider the following. If your horse dies, I suggest that you dismount. I think we have several challenges of that nature that are unsustainable. First, as I've already demonstrated, my friends would tell you I have relentlessly, cruelly bored them and others with my railings about entitlement programs for the elderly. I have tried and failed to make clear, for example, that the trust funds are a fiscal oxymoron. They should not be trusted and they are not funded. The money has already been spent, and even Washington can't spend the same money twice. So while the politicians and bureaucrats anesthetize us with soothing soporifics like the Social Security Trust Fund will keep us solvent, quote unquote, for the next 30 or 40 years, official projections are that your and my children and grandchildren, and I have 9, confront payroll taxes of 38%, well over double what we now pay for Social Security and Medicare. Can we honestly call that solvency? And don't listen to those that tell you we can grow out of these entitlement problems. The Comptroller General of the United States, David Walker, who you might say is the chief accounting and auditing officer of the country, has said that under what he considers to be plausible assumptions, to grow out of our entitlement programs would take about 20% annual growth for 7 decades. Now that's clearly totally unrealistic. Pronouncements from an investment banker on morality do not come convincingly. Still, however unconscious our denial, or however irresponsible our paralysis, slipping this huge hidden check to our own children and grandchildren for our free lunch is at bottom immoral. It was, after all, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German theologian, who once said that the ultimate test of a moral society is the kind of world that it leaves to its children. Healthcare costs are the main cost metastasis, spending nearly over twice as much per capita as the rest of the developed world. We have remarkably little to show for it. We have barely begun to even ask the fundamental but awkward questions of reform to reduce these unsustainable healthcare costs. I only have time to give you one of many. How do we tolerate an out-of-control, open-ended Medicare system where some localities in the United States have 6 times the back surgery and others have 6 times the prostate surgery than in other areas? The blue states and the red states are one thing, but am I to believe that we have bad back and bad prostate states? Or still another unsustainable, our trade deficit and its first cousin, the current account deficit, of a stunning 7% of the GDP, twice the previous record in the 80s when the dollar fell by 1/3. This unsustainable and dysfunctional dependence on foreign capital implies daunting risks that no great country should take. This is one reason that virtually every economist I know is very concerned about the precipitous drop in what they call the net national savings rate. You may be surprised to hear that only 40 years ago, that was 11% of the GDP. It is now less than 1%. Thus, there is widespread agreement that we must increase this country's savings so that we are not so dysfunctionally and recklessly dependent on foreign capital. But if we're to do that, there are only 3 sources that I know. We can increase corporate earnings, but they're already at record levels. I think we're going to have to depend on doing something to reduce our budget deficits that, after all, represent negative savings or government savings. And then we are also going to have to increase significantly personal savings. Let me just take a moment to bring you up to date on how we Americans at the personal level have gone from being among the biggest personal savers in the world to the lowest. In 1992, only 14 years ago, Americans saved personally about 8% of their disposable income. This year, our savings rate has gone negative, roughly to 1% of our disposable income. Now today, since everyone is concerned about China, let's talk about the differences between the two countries on savings. Our net national savings rate is 1%. China's is 32%. Our personal saving rate is minus 0.7%. Theirs is 22%. Their national investment, which is critical to growth, of course, is 43%. Ours is 17%. Now, side by side with our parents' obsession to consume and not to save is our propensity to borrow. You recall that recent commercial where this rather smart-alecky type guy stands up and says, I have a 4-bedroom house, a new car, and I belong to a golf club. How do I do it? He had his own answer. I'm up to my neck in debt, he says. How much are we in debt? Household debt service as a percentage of disposable income is nearly 14%. It's the highest it's been in decades. Today, for example, when gasoline prices rose and people felt squeezed, I was interested to learn that 80% of gasoline transactions are now on a credit card. 3 years ago, that number was only 50%. So I believe increasing personal savings has become a national imperative. Finally, just a few words about energy, still another long-term and at present unsustainable challenge. The President refers to our oil dependence as an addiction. Our ravenous consumption and limp energy policies, in my view, are major enablers. With less than 5% of the population, we consume 25% of the world's oil, and over 4 times the gasoline per capita than other developed countries. Are we to believe that it is just a statistical coincidence that their gasoline taxes are of $3.80 a gallon on average are 10 times higher than ours? How little we hear about reducing our gluttonous consumption, or how unthinkable it is that we run a $300 billion annual oil import bill that deepens the already deep pockets of some of the unfriendliest countries of the world, and thereby help them finance activities very dangerous to our health. And oh yes, there is that troublesome global warming issue. So it is any surprise that one of the wisest of Americans, Paul Volcker, says, altogether, the circumstances seem to be as dangerous and intractable as I could remember. And I can remember a long time. Given that this talk is about business leadership, I have intentionally focused my questions on the business community. But what questions might we be asking ourselves as citizens? With modern political democracies like ours, fixated as we are on the next election, can we deal with silent, slow-motion, long-term challenges, absent a crisis? Because if it requires a crisis, I can assure you it will be a very costly one. Looking back, millions of those in my parents' generation had not only a shared responsibility for the future, but a required sense of shared sacrifice to fulfill that future. If we were to wage the biggest war on history and provide, for example, for a GI Bill of Rights, they would have to pay for it. No free lunch for them. Today, at a time of ballooning deficits, major domestic reconstruction efforts, and shockingly, even at a time of a protracted and costly war, what are our political leaders asking us to give up? The continuing preoccupation of many of my own Republican Party is how the Pete Petersons of this world get their income tax cuts made permanent and their estate taxes eliminated. We have managed to do LBJ better, one better. We have guns, butter, and tax cuts too. Whoopee, I say. One might ask, in this all gain and no pain, in this all get and no give political world, has it become too politically incorrect or terminal to suggest that there are times when some of us might be expected to give up something for the long-term greater good? As you probably know, Lady Thatcher is the only Western leader who has tackled one of these problems that I talked about, their Social Security problem. She eliminated the so-called wage indexing as part of her reform, and as a result, Great Britain is in much better shape on Social Security than any country in the world. I asked Lady Thatcher once, what do you people talk about at your G7 or 8 meetings? Are you aware of the impending costs of the aging and baby boomer boom in your country? She said, oh my, yes, Mr. Peterson. Well, I said, then how do you explain this? She said, I explain it this way. They say that is going to happen not on my watch, but on somebody else's watch. And why should I take the pain for somebody else's gain? And that, I think, is a crisp definition of the challenge we confront today. We seem to want it all, we want it now, and we don't want to give up anything. Finally, have the post-9/11 and weapons of mass destruction trauma left too many of us asking, why not live it up now? Who knows whether we or our children will even have a future. So I call on those of us in business in particular to become business patriots and put ourselves on the line for those policies that we believe will help the long-term interests of our company, our economy, and our country. Can a successful business executive also be a business patriot? I say yes. But I also call on us as citizens, as parents, as grandparents, to share in the sacrifices to meet our shared responsibilities for our future and our children and grandchildren's future. I say we need a movement, so let's get moving. Thank you very much.
Digest these. Yes, the gentleman over here.
Well, you weren't here, but I asked a question about the gas.
Please introduce yourself again.
I'm sorry, Richard Sincata, and I'm at the National Intelligence Council. I asked a question about the gas tax that we don't pay and that you addressed so eloquently. I asked that to Senator Bingham, and he didn't answer it, basically, just laughed it off. And I wonder, okay, how do we approach the U.S. public to pay something that would help us in terms of security and our energy future?
Well, without singling out the senator, I think he suffers from a tendency of 99.5% of our congressmen on the subject of energy. I'm deeply involved with the Council on Foreign Relations, and all of the various presidential candidates, come to the council to speak. 2 or 3 of them have announced bold energy policies. That's in quotes, incidentally. The bold energy policies always involve an increased emphasis on alternative energy sources. The Iowa governor, who recently announced his candidacy, announced a dramatic program, and unsurprisingly it focused on ethanol, as you might imagine. In Iowa. I have asked several of these people, without embarrassing any one of them, tell me who could possibly object to more focus on alternative energy sources of various kinds. But have you made a quantitative estimate in terms of how much that would reduce our oil dependency over a reasonable time frame of 3 to 5 years? They tend to blush because the answer, almost without exception, on these alternative energies is a very few percent. So I think the problem, fundamentally, is there are only about 3 proposals that I've heard that are likely on the near term or reasonably near term. have a very substantial impact. One is clearly an energy tax, and there are several forms of that. Another is much tougher CAFE standards on mileage. And the third, of course, is nuclear power. And as you know, France now gets, I believe, 80% of their electrical power from nuclear. I've forgotten the Japanese number. I think it's 40 to 50%, something of that sort. We haven't built a nuclear plant in, I think, 20 years. So I think the energy problem is a classic example of what I'm talking about. It isn't though there aren't solutions there, but every one of them requires somebody to give up something, you know, in the course of it. I think personally it's going to take several things, probably. I've been very impressed with what happened with the 9/11 Commission, where two very able people, including Lee, not only devoted immense intellectual energy, but a lot of time to follow up and educate the American public. And because they were credible and serious people, I think they helped persuade America, because they appeared on every television show I know, on the nature of the problems. I really think we're going to have to seriously consider on the entitlements problem, because there's so many myths that exist, just to take one example. Assembling a group of the quality of Alan Greenspan and Paul Volcker and Bob Rubin and Sam Nunn and Warren Rudman and people of that quality, whose integrity is beyond question, to not only study these programs, but to help take the responsibility of helping to educate the American people. And I think it's long past time to do that. Because as I indicated when George Bush came up with his Social Security program, I at least admire him for bringing it up, but my enthusiasm for its specific elements is a bit restrained. Let's leave it at that. I think it's going to take an effort of that kind. I think it's going to take an effort by a president who is trusted and courageous, and it's clearly going to take bipartisan effort to have any chance of getting there. Because if the American people, just to take Social Security as an example, believe that the system is solvent for 40 or 50 years, why the hell should they worry about it in a short-termitist world of the type we have? So it's going to take some combination of those elements. I hope it doesn't take a crisis, because if we have a genuine crisis, the cost would be much higher than we currently are anticipating.
Secretary, let me adapt a couple of questions to your call for a blue ribbon credible commission. If we had such a commission, would you set specific priorities? Which problems should they look at first?
I'd be thrilled if they tackled one of the ones I mentioned. I guess because I've reeled about it so long, I think the entitlement problem is the biggest one, just in terms of the massive resources that it consumes. And I'd like to underline the point I'm trying to make, probably not too well. When people talk about investment, it requires savings. And the savings, you don't consume. And you have to make a choice between consumption and savings. If you look at these programs that are consuming an additional 9% of the GDP on top of everything else, think of those in terms of whether they're consumption or investment. And they're very largely consumption. I mean, Pete Peterson is not about the future. My grandchildren are about the future. And that's why we want to emphasize education and R&D. So the reason I would attack those programs, I think they are the prime example of consumption largesse in this country.
On the investment question, let me take a question from Joel Hetker. He's asking about, with the degree of investment that we do have, a great deal of it now goes to housing. Should we adopt policies that encourage redirecting some of that into manufacturing or service investment?
Yeah, you know, if I were to list the risks that I hope never happen, a fascinating thing has happened with housing. people ask me, how is it that people can spend more than they earn? It seems like a contradiction of sorts. Well, they've been obviously using their assumed housing wealth. People then say, well, aren't those savings? And I say, well, they're one kind of savings, I guess. But I need savings and you need savings you can invest that are usable. And the increase in the housing net worth is not usable savings to begin with. Now, something fascinating is happening in this country, and maybe the Woodrow Wilson Center ought to explore it. I've urged college leaders and academic think tanks like yours to try to understand how we went from one of the biggest savers in the world to the biggest consumers and borrowers, because that's a cultural change of deep magnitude. And I have a lot of theories. But one of the things you may recall that happened after the Second World War, our plants were thoroughly intact, the rest of the world's were destroyed. And we needed to build demand so that these plants could be kept busy, building houses and selling appliances and so forth. So we did a variety of things. We had an unlimited mortgage interest deduction, right? We had Fannie Mae's and so forth to bring down costs. Now that may have been a short-term appropriate place to get the economy going, but there's nothing that suggests to me that this is our primary need today. And one of the risks that we're taking with our economy today is, you probably know that about 43%, I believe, of the new houses are no down payment, interest only. About 50% of the new mortgage applications are floating rate or adjustable rate. And the one thing that concerns me, because we've been depending on housing to keep consumption going, is if anything were to happen to the dollar, for example, because of the current account deficit, interest rates were to go up, you could see a very significant effect on this economy. So I think, at the risk of insulting the housing industry, the time has come to re-look at where our priorities ought to be. And I don't think the future of America depends on our building that many more houses. I'd much rather put it in research, development, and innovation.
Let me just ask one last question, if I may, picking up on your comment about the current account and the risk that poses for the financial markets and potential collapse and rise in interest rates. How would you attack that trade in current account deficit? Are there 2 or 3 possibilities?
Yeah, there's some things that we need to do, and there's some things that others need to do. And I don't mean to be just blaming the United States, because the rest of the world has gotten hooked on this dysfunctional dependence. Starting at home, I think nothing is more important than getting our fiscal house in order and keeping confidence in the U.S. economy going. Because the dollar is a lot about confidence. And a lack of confidence can be triggered by all kinds of things. Geopolitical events, a stupid comment by the Treasury Secretary, or any number of things that you could imagine. So I think what we have to do is get our house in order and increase domestic savings so that we're not so dependent. We have to, by definition, consume less, import less, and export relatively more. Now, there's a lot of focus in the world on what the United States needs to do, but there's damn little on what the rest of the world has to do. You have a situation like China, where clearly their economic strategy has been essentially export-led. And they've got 20 or 25 million jobs they've got to create every year due to the people leaving the farms. And they see that this huge export surplus as a way of solving their domestic problem and ultimately their domestic stability. Well, I don't know how many of you know these numbers, but these are numbers beyond anything. If I'd been in the White House and my job as International Economic Advisor and looked at numbers like 7% of the GDP current account deficit, China this year is expected to have a 9% current account surplus. So they're essentially depending on a essentially unsustainable situation to help them solve their domestic problems. So what do they have to do? They have to do the opposite of what we have to do. They have to consume more, they have to invest less, they have to import more. And Europe has to do much of the same. But China is beginning to talk about that adjustment. But the progress is pretty damn slow. And the rest of the world has kind of enjoyed this symbiotic, dysfunctional partnership, where, as Fred Berkson put it, it's a new definition of supply side. They supply the goods and they also supply the money. Well, that can't continue indefinitely. So it's going to require some changes in the United States, but very importantly, it's going to require some fundamental changes in their own domestic strategy towards stimulating their own demand instead of depending on us. Well, thank you all very much. It's a pleasure.
Thank you all. We now, with much food for thought, we are actually going to have some real food while we listen to the next panel. The next panel could go ahead and take their places there. React to these new opportunities and these new challenges. Just as a warning to everyone, that although we have been talking about rising above the gathering storm, the physical gathering storm may be closer than we think, that it's raining, and Washington, D.C. has been put under a tornado watch until 6 o'clock. So this is the challenge for the next panel. Can they match that kind of force that we associate with the tornado? It's my enormous pleasure now to introduce the chair that's... Excuse me, everyone take their seats if they would, please. We're about to start. It's my enormous pleasure to introduce the moderator of the next panel, an old friend, Bruce Stokes. I suspect he is a familiar name to almost all of you. He has been the leading international correspondent for the National Journal for 2 decades. I got to know him back in the competitiveness era in the 1980s. He again was something of a Boswell of that movement and has continued to be a path-breaking journalist. He's an award-winning journalist. He's covered the world, key countries of the world. He has been part of the Pew Survey of Global Opinion, and more recently is now doubling as a senior fellow and leader of the Growth Project at the New America Foundation. Bruce.
Thanks, Kent. I'd like to welcome all of you to the panel where the rubber meets the road here. We're going to talk about policy and private sector implications of some of the material that was laid out in the previous panels. And in particular, it seems to me we were chastened by Pete Peterson's warnings of the urgency of improving American competitiveness, because we obviously need a more competitive and productive economy if we are to foot the bill for some of the entitlement challenges, the current account deficit challenge, our lack of savings, and so forth. So without further ado, I want to introduce our panelists. They will go in the order in which they're sitting, I think, if that's okay with everybody. Their presentations will be relatively short, 7 to 8 minutes, and I'm going to enforce that so that we have a lot of time for discussion. Our first panelist is Vinod Agarwal, who is a professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of California at Berkeley. He's currently involved in research on comparative regionalism in Europe, North America, and Asia, with a focus on its implications for the international system and multinational corporations. Our second panelist is Susan Butts, who's the Senior Director of External Science and Technology Programs at the Dow Chemical Company, where she is responsible for Dow's sponsored research programs at over 150 universities, institutes, and national labs. And our next speaker, if I can find the introduction, is Rob Atkinson. Rob is an old friend who is now the president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, but I knew him when he was the vice president of the Progressive Policy Institute and director of PPI's Technology and New Economy Project. Our last speaker will be Ralph Gamori, who is president of the Alfred P. Did I mispronounce your name? I'm sorry.
Try Gomery.
Gomery, okay.
That's what I would have said.
The emphasis on the wrong syllable here.
Yeah.
Yes. Ralph is the president of the Alfred B. Sloan Foundation. It looks like I won't be getting any grants from the
I think you've relented sufficiently swiftly.
He has had an extensive career in the private sector, which culminated in being the IBM Senior Vice President for Science and Technology before taking over at Alfred P. Sloan. We'll start off with Professor Aggarwal.
Thank you very much for this invitation, and I'd like to thank Kent Hughes and Lynn Shaw for organizing this very timely conference. I'm a little bit embarrassed because I teach in the business school also, but I always have a PowerPoint presentation, but I actually don't have one. So I'm a little nervous about this, but I'll give it a try actually speaking as opposed to flashing my slides to you. But let me begin by talking about the 3 points I'd like to make because I know there's a strict time limit. So first I'd like to talk about the context of some of the theoretical models we see in economics in view of the previous conference that was held at the center. Second, I'd like to talk about the link between domestic and international policies and how they might fit together. Now, in view of the panel's division of labor, I will be focusing mainly on the third topic, as is advertised, which is looking at how we might negotiate with advanced developing countries. And in particular, I'll look at the costs and benefits of different types of approaches, be they unilateral, bilateral, minilateral, or multilateral, and we'll see what the advantages are in different cases and disadvantages. As in many other disciplines, economists are very good at building models that mimic current trends. And despite the view that economic models spring up from tabula rasa mathematical assumptions, most models in economics often look suspiciously like what we might call lagged variables that simply track real-world developments. Now, this is not necessarily bad. After all, if you had completely abstract models that bear no resemblance to reality, it would really not do us much good in an empirical science, although I fear economics has managed to move in that direction. Yet the problem in my mind has more to do with the fact of how these models might be based on a political agenda and often are portrayed as pure unbiased science. So by now you must think I am a wild-eyed Berkeley postmodern radical, so let me quote from the latest edition of the leading international economics textbook by Paul Krugman and Murray Obstfeld. So in discussing Ricardo and the theory of comparative advantage, they noted the following. Ricardo knew that the repeal of the Corn Laws would make capitalists better off, but landowners worse off. From his point of view, this was all to the good. A London businessman himself, he preferred the hard-working capitalists to idle-landed aristocrats. But he chose to present his argument in the form of a model that assumed away the issues of internal income distribution. And we ask, why did he do this? Almost surely the answer is political. While Ricardo was in reality to some extent representing interests of a single group, he emphasized the gains to the nation as a whole. This was a clever and thoroughly modern strategy, one that pioneered the use of economic theory as a political instrument. So the political nature of economic models can really hardly escape the attention of developing countries. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, liberal economists argued that import substitution industrialization to alter one's comparative advantage, as was advocated by other economists such as Robert Prebisch, were absolute folly. Now, I would hardly endorse ISI or import substitution policies as a strategy and a success, but in doing this, all government policies of promoting industries, such as those pursued in Japan and South Korea, were tarred with the same critique, that all government intervention to promote comparative advantage was bad. Yet when Japan and Korea became dynamic exporters in the 1970s and 1980s, strategic trade policy became the topic of the day in Washington. And this showed in strategic trade policy, in Krugman's work and other work, that countries could manipulate the terms of trade and become successful. And this was very popular, as I said, in the United States. But when the Japanese economic boom fell apart for actually somewhat unrelated reasons, such analysis fell out of favor. And we now see that revival again. So now we see this recent work by Gomori, sorry, I'll kill your name again. Since my name is Agarwal and nobody can pronounce it, I should be happy that someone else has a name like this, Gomori and Baumol, and Paul Samuelson are seen to be of great importance as containing novel insights for trade theory, many of which argue that one can manipulate the terms of trade. And Samuelson, of course, as the inventor of much of trade theory, makes a very big impact. Yet surely the Chinese might be forgiven, as well as other successful exporters, for believing that revisions in our trade models are highly correlated with our trade deficit. So let me turn now to my second topic of domestic and international connections and responses to competitions. How might we deal with the competitive threat? Now, with respect to domestic policies, one cannot avoid being struck by the long-standing, what I think is a politically sterile debate about trade. Most Republicans, and I say most to rule out the so-called nationalist camp led by those such as Pat Buchanan, have long argued for free trade, unless, of course, they're from textile states. Yet Republicans have unfortunately bought into the classic liberal laissez-faire view of the general economy, and therefore have little to say about the implications of income losses in sectors which are negatively affected, and have a very naive understanding, ironically, of American domestic politics. Despite theories about smooth economic adjustment, we have not seen steel workers and auto workers rushing to become nurses, despite the high salaries in this profession, and now the current effort to import more and more nurses from around the world. Instead, together with firms in the textile industry and agriculture, they have preferred to invest in getting senators and congressmen to provide them with protection, rather than investing in technological innovation, education, and job retraining. Now, for their part, Democrats have increasingly become the party of protection, although the leadership has often been more free trade oriented than the rank and file. And indeed, President Bill Clinton's success in getting a few Democrats to go along with Republicans in NAFTA was seen as a great success. So in my view, considerable bipartisan attention needs to be devoted to properly managing our international trade policy and linking it to a domestic strategy. This would involve things that we've discussed this morning, such as portable pensions and health benefit portability and significant aid for technological innovation. But frankly, I think that the idea of having proactive trade adjustment assistance will never become a sexy Washington topic. And so I fear that this, in fact, will never really take place, and yet I think it's the most central issue of the day. So let me now turn to the third topic of negotiating with developing countries, ADCs, or advanced developing countries. Now, in terms of the use of unilateral measures, for the most part, if you actually implement these unilateral measures, they don't really work out very well. On the other hand, in some cases, they may serve as a useful threat to promote negotiations through, say, the WTO and other institutions, which I'll talk about. And the most recent example of this is the Graham-Schumer bill that seeks to impose high tariffs on China because of their currency policy. And it's quite clear that the Chinese have, in fact, been manipulating their currency. But it seems to me that the impetus here, or the strategy, might be to go to the IMF and international institutions and push at that level while holding back this kind of a threat, because that probably will not be extremely successful and will lead to retaliation. Now, the latest craze in Washington, of course, in trade agreements was bilateral trade agreements in the form of what have been called preferential trade agreements. And these are seen as a superficially, I think, superficially positive means of extracting concessions from the developing countries. Indeed, some have advocated this as the best policy for the U.S. to pursue and have called this competitive liberalization. But for the most part, I think the strategy has been a disaster. By turning trade accords into highly specific and tailored agreements suiting various industries, the broad coalition for trade has been undermined. And so what I think what's happening now is, with the lack of trade policy authority, which will probably disappear next year, I think the Asians will continue with these agreements and we'll be left without them. So given time constraints, let me turn to the last topic, which is multilateralism as a strategy. And here I think the use of the dispute settlement mechanism is really where we should be focusing our attention. And the benefits of working through the WTO are clear. You have a rule-based system which has much greater legitimacy, whereas if you simply unilaterally try to retaliate, we don't have much luck. We can also see that you have much greater success in dealing with these countries at the time of accession to the WTO than afterwards. But in my mind, because innovation is the key to reaping benefits from trade, the WTO forum should be used to make sure that national innovation does not depend on forced technology transfer. And although firms may be willing to comply with national demands for strategy for market access and turn over their technology, these actions will undermine U.S. competitiveness over the long run. So to sum up, it's time for the U.S. to develop a coherent trade and domestic policy to enhance both its position in the global economy and to promote global growth. The notion that the market will take care of all problems and that government policies can have no pro-competitive effects is clearly false. To paraphrase John Maynard Keynes, it is time for practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influences to stop being the slaves of some defunct economic model of static comparative advantage. Thank you.
Well, I'm delighted to be here today, and I'm going to offer you something I think rather different from the previous talks, and then I'm going to take a very practical approach to some of the issues that we're considering today. First of all, as Bruce mentioned, I work for the Dow Chemical Company, which is a multinational corporation. We have about $45 billion in annual sales. We're either the largest or the second largest chemical company in the world. We compete directly with BASF, so sometimes depending on the exchange rate between the euro and the dollar, we may switch positions. But basically, we face the decisions every day about how we're going to be successful in selling our products around the world. And in particular, what I wanted to address today is how we make decisions about where to locate our assets. And we make decisions about two types of assets, both the physical assets like our manufacturing plants and the human assets like the people in our research and development laboratories. So in thinking about the intersection of the factors that drive these business decisions and policy, which is really the focus of the meeting today, it occurred to me that that intersection is in fact rather messy, because sometimes policy can have a direct and controlling impact on these factors. More often the impact is going to be indirect, and sometimes it's irrelevant. And so the trick for looking at these issues is figuring out what are the areas where the policy impacts are most critical. In fact, looking at the title of the program today that said National Strategies to Build Comparative Advantage, what occurred to me is that what's really important to companies is not comparative advantage, but competitive advantage. So a comparative advantage that doesn't offer a competitive advantage is really what I'd call an irrelevant one. If you think about, in the simplest terms, what's the imperative for companies, it's really to maximize their sustainable profitability over time. And it's this objective that drives the long-term strategic decisions about where we locate our assets. And I wanted to talk about some of the factors that we take into consideration when we make these decisions. If you think about the way decision-making is done in corporations, there are many, many things that will determine whether or not a particular decision to locate assets will give us a comparative advantage or not. Or, excuse me, a competitive advantage or not. So we're always trying to maximize the competitive advantage, minimize or eliminate the competitive disadvantages. But the principal things that we look at include, and I'm going to list a number of them. This is not a comprehensive list, but I think gives us enough for good discussion later on. We're concerned about cost, availability, and quality of the following items: our raw materials, our labor force, the infrastructure that we have to work within. So for all of those, cost, availability, and quality are key issues. There are other things that we consider, such as government incentives or government penalties. So a government penalty, for instance, might be taxes. A government incentive might be a tax credit. We also look at things which are much less quantitative, more qualitative, but they're nonetheless important. And they include things like the innovation climate. And the innovation climate is pretty complex because it can take into account the quality of the education system that's producing the workforce. It can take into account a company's ability to access the resources available at universities. It can also include things like intellectual property protection. Another factor would be the regulatory and legal climate in which a company has to operate. And last but certainly not least, I would say access to markets. And that would include both net market growth, which may occur in some geographies, as well as increase in market share. So in trying to make our decisions about where to locate assets, we're going to take all of those things into account. And as you can imagine, since this is not a very quantitative exercise, sometimes the net balance of advantage versus disadvantage is not clear. We often have to make estimates and projections and sometimes even guesses. But in some occasions, I think we find that a few of those factors that I mentioned become really dominant and the decisions become clear. I'd like to go through a couple of examples to help illustrate that, and I wanted to mention in particular a publication. This was actually a report to the Government University Industry Research Roundtable of the National Academies, and it's called Here or There, A Survey of Factors in Multinational R&D Location. So because I'm from R&D, I'm more comfortable talking about that than talking about our manufacturing assets. But this was a very interesting study, and it was actually provoked because of some discussion that came up within the Government University Industry Research Roundtable about the fact that it appeared that more and more large U.S.-based companies were starting to build R&D facilities in the emerging geographies like China and India. And the discussion was, is this like manufacturing in the sense that big companies are going to India and China because of a lower labor cost, or is there some other factor that's really driving this? And so this study was conducted by two economists, Marie and Jerry Thursby. Marie is at Georgia Tech and Jerry is at Emory University. And what they did was to survey about 240 companies in the US and in Europe, and they asked them questions about factors that influence their decision to build an R&D facility that they've recently completed or one that they're planning to build. And I think an important point is they didn't try to ask the broad philosophical question about how do you decide whether to build in the US or China, but they asked about a specific facility because they wanted to avoid having people give back sort of philosophical expectant answers. And some of the interesting things that came out of the study were that when companies that were home-based in developed economies like the US and Europe decided to locate in the emerging economies like China and India, the most important driving factor for them was access to these fastly growing markets. So the opportunity to have a growth in sales and profitability by simply reaching a population that they'd not been able to sell to before was by far the most important factor. Now, there were other things that came into play as benefits, and some of the ones that the study elucidated were the quality of the employees that companies felt they could hire in those geographies, in part because of the increasing quality of the universities in places like China and India. Companies were also concerned about access to university resources, both equipment resources as well as the ability to collaborate with faculty members on doing more fundamental research. And then they also saw a benefit in cost. But I would caution on the cost issue that I think most companies, including mine, feel that the differential in labor cost between the developed economies and the developing economies is something that's going to change over time, and that differential will decrease. And so it wouldn't be a good long-term strategic decision for us to build in China because we have a short-term large differential in labor cost. So we see the difference in labor cost to be a nice collateral benefit that comes from being in China, but that's not why we're there. We're there because we want to be able to sell our products to that very large and fastly growing economy. I wanted to give you just one other example that has to do with making decisions about manufacturing assets. And sometimes you can see that while you may have a grand strategy, it may not work for you, and you have to make individual decisions. And I'll give you an example of that from my own company. In general, the Dow Chemical Company tries to build large, world-scale, fully integrated manufacturing facilities. So we feel that it's to our advantage, it gives us a competitive advantage if we can go from the very beginning of the supply chain through to our products, have everything together in a large integrated site. However, Coming back to issues like infrastructure and cost, sometimes that strategy doesn't make sense and we have to deviate from it, and I'll give you an example of that. Most of the things that Dow makes you probably don't know, but there is one that you may recognize, and that's styrofoam. That's blue board that people use in housing insulation. Interestingly enough, because that's such a product with such a low density, so these are large boards with a low density, the cost of shipping them, an intercontinental shipment, can't be justified relative to the sale cost of the product. So although it's not very heavy, it takes up a lot of space, and it's too expensive to actually ship those products from a world-scale plant that might be built, say, in the U.S. So for physical assets in a business like that, we actually have, for a long time, been building plants around the world so that we can supply local markets from local plants. So in closing, I'd like to say that I think that it's very important to think about how policy impacts these factors that I mentioned, and some of them are of extreme interest to me, especially the ones that have to do with innovation and competitiveness and the link between research and corporate profitability, but perhaps that's something we can get to in the discussion phase. So thank you very much.
Good afternoon, and I'm going to start by pronouncing Ralph Gomery's name right. So, now that I've done that, I want to talk a little bit about, maybe give a little more cautious or skeptical view of some of the trade some of the competitiveness debate. Skip through that. Let me just start by saying, why do we care about this? And I think it's sort of almost, we seem to care about it almost because it's motherhood and apple pie. I think we care about competitiveness for a fairly straightforward reason. We want, and any country wants, to be producing on the higher value-added shift, the higher value-added end of production, not the lower value-added end. And when our economy essentially wasn't all that traded, most of in the old economy, that wasn't very much trade. That whole debate really didn't matter all that much, whether we imported or exported high value added. It was a small share of our overall prosperity. Now that we're much more traded, that matters quite a bit more. But I also just want to caution, I think we can sort of overstate the importance of competitiveness. Even I think I can say that. When you look at it, in reality, most of our standard of living and our prosperity is due to domestic productivity factors, not trade factors. We've got a report coming out in January on the role of IT in productivity growth and economic growth, and it turns out it's phenomenal. It's virtually 100% of the labor productivity pickup from the post-96 pickup is due to the use and production of information technology. So that's not to say that trade is not important. It certainly is, but I think we've got to keep it in perspective as we have these debates. I ended up writing this book last year called The Past and Future of America's Economy. And one of the points I made in the book was that this transition that we've gone through today, or we're going through today, really enabled largely by technology, is quite similar to one we went through earlier in our history. In the post-war period, we opened up, really became a national market for the first time. Really, people don't remember that, but pre-World War II, we were largely a set of regional markets. We became a national market. Production could locate anywhere in the U.S., and it largely did. And what we saw was dramatic shifts in production, particularly out of high-cost regions to low-cost regions, quite similar to what we're seeing today. And there were, if you think about sort of what happened to those regions who were on the losing end of that, there were really sort of two paths that those regions took. One was what you could call renewal through innovation, and that's largely a New England story. Their per capita income continued to rise, sort of took a dip as they adjusted, and then rose largely because they moved into the higher value-added sectors. Then there are other parts of the country, the Great Lakes and Pennsylvania and other parts, that really never adjusted and lost it and then continued to lose it. Now their absolute incomes have gone up as the overall GDP and per capita income has gone up, but relatively they've gone down. I think that's sort of in some ways the central question we face as a country is which of those paths now as a nation are we going to go down? So what I'm supposed to talk about is what are we supposed to do, and I guess I'm sort of less optimistic about the debate maybe than some people are, because to me there's still large swaths of the intelligentsia in Washington who is in denial whether there's a real problem. So you have sort of one side that says don't do anything, then you have another side that says, okay, we've got a problem now, what do we do? And I would put those camps, if you had to sort of parse the intellectual debate, into really two categories. One is which I think is probably 80 to 90% of the debate, which is really the sort of supply side camp, and I don't mean that in the Reaganomics side, but the supply side camp that says, really this is just simply a problem of we need to have a little more research here, we need to have better educated workers, and if we sort of build these supply components that globally competitive companies can rely upon, they will stay here, they will locate here, and everything will be fine. I'm, very, I guess, skeptical of that notion. I think that while it's a nice notion, it's not a sufficient notion. I think what the other part of that debate says is that we need to think about not just boosting supply, but boosting the demand by multinational companies for doing high value-added, innovation-based work here in the United States. Why is there so much focus on the supply side? Vinny took some nice shots at neoclassical economists, which I enjoyed, and I'll pile on. I always like doing that. According to the neoclassical view, and you read this not just in economic journals, but in the pundits who are writing in Washington, what's his name, the Washington Post is Malaby's the classic example of this. It's according to Sebastian, firms compete, but countries don't compete. Now, if you buy that notion, then it really means that we don't have to do anything other than simply make sure that those resources are readjusted and moved through the economy. So if a firm happens to lose in global competition, yeah, it's too bad for the firm, that's tough luck, but we got to help the workers find new jobs. That's pretty much the policy conclusion that stems from that. Why is that wrong? I think it's wrong largely because it ignores the fact that you cannot quickly reassemble these disparate factors of production once they're lost and put them back into something that's even more high value added. More likely what will happen is they'll reassemble and they'll be working at McDonald's. Using an analogy, if we were to lose Boeing, for example, which luckily it looks like we're not now, but for a while there the Europeans were going to do as much as they could to cheat and distort the market to try to gain competitive advantage in aviation. And if they had put Boeing out of business, we would never ever again recreate Boeing no matter how low the dollar went. It's impossible because of all the knowledge, embeddedness, and network effects that happen there. So what do we need to do if that's the case? I think that I don't want to have my comments interpreted as saying that the Bingham and Alexander bill and the Pace report and the Pace bills and the Lieberman and Ensign bills are not important. They certainly are. We need to do more of that. We're one of the few countries that's seen a decline of national total research